Hi again, Jason Lenzi here. This is the intro for part two of my conversation with Alex Ross about Jack Kirby. Alex and I, as I've said, have had thousands of conversations about thousands of things, about all kinds of pop culture. But one of his absolute heroes is Jack Kirby, and I think it comes through in some of the pieces that we're talking about. There's a lot of love coming from Alex for Jack, and I hope you enjoy it. Here it is. All right, here we are again with part two of the Jack Kirby tribute on Tangents with Alex and Jason. And so I wanted to kick off with the collages. There's a beautiful collage photo that I sent, an FF piece that looks like it's out in space or inside a machine or I don't know what. But that look to me is very psychedelic. It's very trippy. And I can't tell if it's pre psychedelia. I mean, I don't know what day psychedelic looks kind of started at, but when that was. But was this something that I know both he and Steranko did the collage thing, but you're thinking Kirby did it first, probably, right?
Yeah. I believe he was doing this before anybody else in comics, and then Steranko did it not nearly as much as Jack. I mean, I can think of, two instances in maybe the Shield comics that Steranko did it.
Okay.
But it wasn't his bag as much as it was Jack's thing.
But it's pretty, I mean, radical, I suppose, for a comic book, right? It's a very, sure. I mean, as you were saying to me the other day, collages were, getting more popular at the time, and you probably saw them in more magazines and more, articles, like magazine spreads, photo spreads for articles and magazines and such. But that must have been a very bold thing to do in a comic book at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And it would have screamed to people at the time, like, oh my God, look at how somebody's pushing the envelope.
Mm.
I mean, it might have seemed particularly abstract and weird, like, oh my God, this doesn't really fit with the rest of the artwork. But, there's no complaints I'm aware of that people didn't like it as a device.
So I'm going to start with, continue with this other piece, and then ask you the big question. But the Fantastic Four issue with Galactus on the cover, Silver Surfer, If This Be Doomsday, that story looms fairly large in his legend, correct? And in comic book legend, okay. What is it about that is kind of a mini sort of game changer at the time?
Because people were, mostly due to Marvel, getting used to serialized storylines that would seem to have a certain level of import and drama, the extension of, we got multiple issues relating an arc of something. The stakes were raised to the idea of, like, your hero team is going up against an embodiment of a threat that's on a godlike level. And nobody would be able to articulate with the same sense of cosmic proportions as Kirby would. So that was what was really connecting to people, and the idea of, like, oh my God, where are they going to take it? And of course, the Marvel Universe is only, at that point, a few years old. I mean, 61 to 66, when that came out, there's only 5 years of stuff. And then also 66 is the year that you both get the Batman TV show and the Marvel first adaptations in cartoon form are happening on TV.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of excitement for their properties reaching a wider public consciousness.
And also you get the pop art movement too that really starts to kick off both sides of the Atlantic, but obviously very big in the UK with the mod scene and models and fashion and music and everything else. But they would say when the mod thing kind of happened in the UK, it was like England burst into color. Everything was black and white before that, and suddenly there were bursts of color. You totally get why there was such an attraction to this kind of art from the youth, from pop stars and actors and stuff, and it wasn't treated as a throwaway. It wasn't treated as. I mean, isn't that around the time that it starts getting looked at differently when you get the likes of Fellini? Loving that stuff, and it's sort of, it's elevated. I don't know if it's DC as much as Marvel,
but it's not just kid stuff. It's looked at differently at that time.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Marvel was the engine driving this forward. DC would have benefited only in the sake that they were still the biggest powerhouse of known properties, and they sold the most comics. And, of course, their version of abstraction was to do crazy and crazier storylines in their various comics, like Jimmy Olsen's of, what monster could you turn him to this issue? And there wasn't a sense of how to follow the trends or understanding where the generations were maturing into.
Mm-hmm.
But keep in mind, both Marvel and DC are places that are not hiring young people. They're still employing middle-aged men to create all this content. So
right.
The Marvel Revolution is still being created by adults. The youngest person, I think, to join their ranks would eventually be Steranko.
Isn't that interesting that so much of that stuff at the time was appealing to a counterculture, youth kind of audience, fashionable audience, but it's being delivered by, let's just say, people that weren't necessarily taking drugs and, dropping acid and whatever.
They definitely weren't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like when you get into the stuff about who was creating that content for entertainment for music. It's like, well, we know George Martin wasn't getting high with the guys.
Right.
And he already had a history of working with comedy and all the innovative stuff that he did before he was even working with the Beatles. And then what he could contribute along the way elevated their stuff, and say like his symphonic score for the parts of Yellow Submarine was just absolute poetry. That music.
I agree. Yeah.
And really, so to just say that somehow it demands somebody be of a certain age group or they need to be tuned in, as the old phrase used to be, it's almost in a way they need to be sympathetic to an ideology or a sense of forward momentum. And sometimes there's real advancements that come from people that are trying to just simply cash in on what they see as a thing happening, but they're not really part of that target audience.
Well, that leads me to my theory, which I've mentioned before, but I shall say again on this platform. The 2001 adaptation and a sort of extension that Kirby does in 73, 74, 75 when that comes out?
Oh, more like 77.
77, okay. Well, my theory is that he sees 2001, the film, the Kubrick film, and it blows his mind. And he sees in cinema what he's been trying to articulate on the printed page. And so the fact that he would be drawn to it and then want to do an interpretation of it makes total sense to me, because now he's really off the chain, because he's going, okay, well, I already know how trippy this thing was, again, being fairly straight-laced or whatever. And then because it is a strange book, he really... we haven't really talked about this, but the way he sort of draws faces, they're not all the same, but some of them, we've talked about this, where the eyes are very far apart and the mouth is very wide and so on. It really gets crazy in the 2001 comic, I think, where he's just having a blast. He's going, let me see how weird I can get with this stuff. That's what I think. I think he found it appealing, and then it just made logical sense. I mean, he also did that Prisoner. Do you have that? Did you ever get that? The big when they finally did a printing?
No, I didn't get the printed book, but it turns out I have had a set of Xeroxes that for years.
Okay.
So I've had access to that for a very, very long time.
Which is another thing that that issue that I think there's two issues maybe, and one is Kirby, and the other one, who's the other artist? I always forget who the other artist is. But the Kirby one is kind of the pilot. I mean, it's kind of the premiere episode, Arrival. And again,
isn't the other one Gil Kane?
Gil Kane, that's it. And I think about The Prisoner and go, well, that would totally appeal to Kirby. I would totally get why that would he would dig that, because it feels kind of like a Kirby comic in some ways. It's a strange show.
And that's the thing. I became fascinated with something that I know didn't really enter his wheelhouse, because Kirby, as much as he was observing things like the Star Trek show in the late 60s, and things that were in movies like 2001. I figured other things that were happening in the rest of the world could have reached his eyes, but likely didn't because of whatever ways these things are syndicated or don't even broach cultural lines. But I always thought, like, what if Kirby was able to take in the pop culture that was happening of a similar type going on internationally? So, like, say, the genre material that was being made in other parts of Europe and in Asia, like, imagine if he was seeing what Ultraman looked like, or God, for France, I'm trying to remember the name of the character that was their big thing there.
Like Corto Maltese or Tintin, the Belgian boy?
No. I'm trying to remember the name of. It's not Phantasm. It's something like that. But basically, there's all those things that I thought would be really cool to imagine him almost taking in and doing his interpretation of those influences, which led me to a series of illustrations I've published before that are kind of like my take on how I would have written the FF if I was put in charge of it, just almost flow with, if Jack had never left the book in 1970 and it wasn't dedicated to just working in the New Gods concepts that he gave to DC, what if he was still interpreting things he was watching from movies and television? And now if you broaden the scope to include the other pop culture stuff that was happening across the world, imagine what that might have led to. Because half of the things that we identify as his creations from the 60s are things that just spat back out stuff he was watching on television, or reading about, concepts that he was reacting to in real time. And there could have been more of that,
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. I want to talk also about Thundarr, because in the late 70s, early 80s, he starts doing stuff for Ruby Spears. Actually, he did work on the FF animated series in '79 too, right? Was that Ruby Spears, or was it like Fritz Frelling or somebody at Frelling Studios or something like that?
Didn't Patley Freeling?
Yeah, was that who that was? That with Herbie?
I think so, yeah.
So he did work on that, which you can certainly see in the design, and then he goes on to do Thundarr, and he's going off the Alex Toth drawings originally. There's a piece here that's sort of a concept pitch, sort of, for the future LA, when actually it doesn't look that different than LA right now, frankly, the way it's been made to be a post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. But when you saw that as a kid, did you see patterns there? Did you kind of recognize Kirby's signature in that?
100%, yeah. Anybody watching that stuff of our age group would have said, oh my God, Jack Kirby has a cartoon show. And you just assumed that the whole thing was Jack's design, which ironically, he didn't design the lead characters, but he designed all these other elements, villains and supporting characters and environments. So he did these production pieces that guided the way that stuff would get animated.
And was he brought in by Steve Gerber, Steve Gerber,
yes,
probably most famous, is he most famous for Howard the Duck or for the Swamp Thing stuff he did? Which is which? Because that was,
well, it was Man-Thing.
Man-Thing, sorry, yeah. Man-Thing, yeah.
It was Man-Thing which introduced Howard in that series. That's and then,
yes.
Splintered off to his own, and then, yeah, I watched there's a guy who does great YouTube videos I've been watching a lot of called Strange Brain Parts.
Okay.
The name of it. He's done like a long form video explaining the history of Steve Gerber that was actually really helpful for me. Ooh. Because I've got a lot of Gerber stuff, like his Defenders run, but I'm not a Gerber fan per se, and a lot of the things I study and watch of when people extol the great virtues of these certain writers and comics, I'm often left with like, I still don't get it. I don't know why this person was a thing. And I've read enough Gerber comics that I'm still sort of left going like, I don't see it. Sorry. But I'm trying to understand where you guys are coming from. I swear to God, I'm not trying to be a jerk about this. I want to get it.
Isn't it kind of wild that the Howard the Duck character was such a thing for a couple of years there at that time? Because T-shirts and, yeah. For president buttons, Howard the Duck for president, and there was a campaign and all that stuff. And it's because I've gone back and rediscovered it and read it, and it's an acquired taste for sure. It's a strange book, but it's weird that hit the nerve. I remember one of the first in fact, I think it's in the People magazine. The People magazine that came out in July of '77 with C-3PO on the cover, that covers Star Wars inside. You know, pictures of Lucas and his wife, and Harrison Ford in his house, and Carrie Fisher, and then Mark Hamill with his then girlfriend, who became his wife. In the spread, he's wearing a Howard the Duck T-shirt in '77. So it's like, you know,
you can see the origin of why it sparked off the way it did. Is it seems to clearly be linked to a sense of Howard seemed like the counterculture.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So Howard kind of tapped that certain energy that people responded to by seeing him embody it.
Let's talk about there's a piece that's in the show as you exit the Kirby show. There's Kirby Interpreted. It's kind of a slideshow of different artists that have paid homage, if you will, to Kirby. And one of the several photos of your stuff is from that most recent FF book that is clearly winking at the collage stuff that Kirby did. Tell me about that. I know the whole thing is a love letter to Kirby, but tell me about the collage aspect.
Yeah, I was trying to imitate his style approach by recreating exactly how he went about it, using clippings effectively from 1960s era magazines, of which I inherited a bunch from my parents. I mean, this is something they passed over to me many years before they passed. So I got these from them when I was in my 20s, and I was using them back when I was working on Marvels originally. But here I've saved these things in my files. I still have physical files. And so going back into these things, I'm looking at Look magazines and Life magazines, some Time magazines that are from the 60s. Like, man, they really saved a lot of stuff about the Kennedy assassination from back in 63, you know. So I'm digging through stuff like that physically Kirby could have owned those. I know a lot of the magazines he got for himself were things like Popular Mechanics and stuff that had a lot more science stuff and whatever. I don't have any National Geographics from that time period, but he would have been looking at things like that. There was a bunch of science stuff that was in some of these Life magazines, so I could reference various objects, images, and whatever. And so I just did a thing of picking through all these magazines, finding different things I thought would be great as a piece here and there to abstract from. And so when I composed my final piece, I'm drawing from looking at each of those things. I didn't cut up any of the magazines. I just went to those references, looked at them, drew them, and then painted them as close as I could realistically, so that the final things were as close to photographic as I could make them without actually having done real photo collage as Jack did, because I figured that my work as a painter would be the bridge, that it's as close to what Jack did naturally as I could take it.
Well, that leads me to something that you said to me a while ago about Jack. But first, I want to ask, you know, there's these things in pop culture, these moments, these films, let's say, or, you know, bands or artists, or, you know, the Renaissance that people can point to, whether they like it or not, whether they're into it or not, and you can say that is a high point, that is a moment in time that'll never happen again, that has been hugely influential, yada, yada, yada. Would you say that Jack Kirby, is the most influential comic book artist there's ever been, basically?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with that, why do you think the legend looms so large? How can you word it? How can you boil it down, basically?
It's beautiful. The work was beautiful. The man was beautiful. I reacted to it positively as a kid, and I've been in love with the look of that stuff. Aesthetically, it's just gorgeous to me. I love looking at this artwork. The older I get, the more I love looking back at it. It has like this automatic impact. If I see a Jack Kirby figure in, say, a T-shirt you might run into at Walmart, or some thing out of context, you take some piece of art and you put it somewhere else. The nature of how he was interpreting shapes and forms, and his spotted blacks that oftentimes what's referred to as the Kirby squiggles that are put on shapes that almost seem to be, they're either a decoration of something that's a reflective surface or mirror-like finish on something. And I love the shaping of those elements. I identify with it and appreciate that abstraction of reality and form. And I think it's a natural state of how it does work on people subliminally, that it's sort of a neat impact graphically that has its roots in a bit of the pop art kind of movements in some ways, where he was loosening up when he became more fluid with bringing in those isms and really allowing himself a loosening up where, like, once he was making all of his figures very boxy and wide steps kind of shaping, that's a transformation from what he was drawing like, which was much more realistic in the early 60s, to when he wound up at the end of the 60s. There was this transformation that occurred, and then when you go into really the last great decade of his draftsmanship is the 70s, because even though he worked in the 80s, his skills were declining in part because of physical impact of strokes that he had suffered, which nobody talks about much, but that did happen to him. But in the 70s, he was becoming much more pushing it out, and all of that I react to. I can adore almost every decade of his existence and contribution to the arts.
It seems to me like, I'm not going to name names, but if a medium comes along and then certain artists come along in that world and they take from what's there, they build off of it, and then at some point they start shaping what it becomes. They start defining it and shaping what it becomes. And Kirby and comics, to me, would appear to be one of the best marriages of artist and medium. I can think of maybe if he was a movie poster artist, or if he was, you maybe wouldn't be like the catalog artist, to do clothing or whatever. But there's something about that marriage. But he's morphing and changing it as he goes, and then the ripples are felt kind of behind it. I mean, you said something really beautiful, which was, how you thought of everything he did as a gift. All the art and all he did. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, his contribution over so many years and the contribution of so many concepts, which arguably they're not all thought out to such glorious terms. A lot of it is just immediately what came to mind for him, and he put it down, and now we consider so many of those concepts legendary. But it was his interpretation, is the way that he blurted out something. Once it went in his head and then came out his hands, it was his, and it had a different kind of veneer and sheen to it. Like, you wouldn't know this offhand, but you might, but there's the character that, at the end of the Gorn episode of Star Trek, you find out that the two guys are set up by this other higher elevated alien race that's basically pitting the two cultures against each other. And it's this almost Romanesque dressed figure who's got like the blonde hair with the sort of cut bangs and everything. It looks very, Greco-Roman.
Yeah.
Well, that was his inspiration for the haircut he gave to the character Him. And, of course, Him becomes Adam Warlock. So when he designs that concept, that character, and makes him a shiny gold man, he's pulling for an episode of Star Trek.
Oh, I didn't know. I did not know that. In
Yeah,
fact, I don't think I knew that
did
Him
that all the time.
Became Adam Warlock. I don't think I knew that either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't think so. I remember Him. I remember the covers of those books and being kind of confused by it. But okay, so he was sort of a bit of a magpie himself. He was picking things up from that he was seeing around him and being
all
influenced as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was his thing. He would filter in the influences of anything and everything. He was a voracious reader, and so that. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but like that was a Chariot of the Gods would be instrumental in him creating the entire Eternal saga and series.
Okay, I didn't know
So,
that was a very big book and eventual documentary, but that book was huge at a certain point. Yeah.
I mean, there's the direct relationship there. He read that and he thought, oh, I can think of that's the next level of where he would bring God type figures from. But, you know, if they hadn't canceled the New Gods on him at DC, he might never have gotten around to something like that.
And do you think, besides the people that know comics, that know him and know his work, do you think he's one of the most, if not the most recognized comic book artists there's been? Like the as a name or as a style? Do you think it's something that people?
Yeah, well, like say Neil Adams is right up there in terms of overall impact and just absolutely changing the industry. But because, say, the number of characters that Neil created and that are still actively in use today, which they mostly are, characters like Ra's al Ghul, or, well, he didn't actually create Deadman, but his version of drawing that book really cemented that character in history. But, you know, so there's these things where, you know, well, when you see Green Arrow, we're often thinking of the reworking of that character done by Neil Adams, even though nowadays we don't even use that costume he designed anymore. But him becoming a more fully fledged version of the Robin Hood legend is due to Neil. Okay. And so many other things that Neil did. But the aesthetics of Neil being a more direct, realism-influenced illustrator, bringing in more of a trained illustrator's eye, is something that you can compare to Kirby in the way of, like, why aren't we just talking about guys like him or John Buscema? And that's because, in a way, that's something you can relate to more easily and go, oh, yeah, a thing looks like a thing. Jack Kirby taking a thing and spinning it that much more abstractly, bringing in more elements of technology and geometric shapes and blending them with organic things is something that goes beyond what others did. And there's a lot of great comic artists to list off as to who belongs on the Mount Rushmore of comics.
Right.
You know, Kirby's usually numero uno. And when you finally understand with greater insight, research, and learning how much what we know of Jack's co-creation of the Marvel characters is truly putting more of the weight of that in his hands, then you realize that most of the things you've loved storytelling-wise are from his brain alone. And that's an overwhelming thing to finally come to terms with, that you still have an audience that doesn't fully grasp that, because basically the dialoguing of Stan Lee and the position he held as editor reinforced the fact that he could be listed as writer next to Kirby as artist or Steve Ditko as artist, when both of those men effectively plotted and wrote those books only to get a portion of the credit that they were due.
Right. Which is where you come in as well. I feel like it's been a mini duty of yours, if you will, to do the work that you're doing, but also well, you know what I mean, to kind of will you grow up, for God's sake? But a responsibility, if you will, for you to carry the torch, like to shine a light on him in work that you've done as well, to keep reminding people and spreading the gospel, so to speak, that Kirby's the king and always will be, basically.
Yeah. No, that's something that I'm absolutely passionate about. I mean, I've gotten tons of attention for the work I've done and plenty of support to get to do this work. And at the end of the day, I would be happiest if the memory that is left behind in my contribution is anything I could have highlighted from his greater legend and importance. It's much more relevant for people to know who he is than anybody of my generation.
Well, that's a great place to end this. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. I will try to remind people about Kirby and less about you in future as well.
And that was part 2 of our conversation about Jack Kirby, in honor of the exhibit at the Skirball Museum. There's much more to discuss about Jack Kirby, why he was so marvelous, why he's still the king. And Alex, of course, could talk about him all day, but we thought that would be a nice little refresher for anyone to hear those two episodes. So there'll be more to come. Hope you've enjoyed the first 2 episodes of Tangents with Alex and Jason, or Jason and Alex, depending on how it. We're still testing it with the folks out there.